Welcome to The Explainer. It is April 3rd, 2026. We are now on day 35 of a war that many thought would be over in a flash. We're going to break down how this conflict in Iran is doing way more than just disrupting a region. It's actually forging a new global order right before our very eyes. And look, to really get a sense of the stakes here, check out this quote from analysts. They're not mincing words. For the US, this is now existential, meaning the entire global American empire could come crashing down if this goes wrong. We're not just talking about another war, we're talking about something that could mark the end of an era. So it's been 35 days. That's 5 weeks the world has been watching this plan for a swift victory completely fall apart. And what's rising from the dust? Well, experts are saying it's something huge, a total global transformation. So let's get into exactly how a regional conflict is triggering this massive shift. Okay, so first up, let's talk about the military situation. What's actually happening on the ground? Because, the reality of it is a world away from the quick victory that was promised out of Washington. Right, so military experts have been grading the US-led coalition's performance, and this scorecard tells a really interesting story. Look, tactically, they've done well. An A+ for air dominance, can't argue with that. A solid B+ for missile and drone defense, but the big one, the strategic goal, controlling the Strait of Hormuz, a flat-out E. That's a catastrophic failure at the world's most important oil choke point. And this is where things get interesting. You hear President Trump saying they're on the good road to victory, that it'll all be over very soon. But that's the official story. It's a massive disconnect from the facts we're seeing on the ground, making that optimism really hard to square with reality. So it really begs the question, right? And it's what analysts are asking. With the world's most vital oil artery completely blocked, what does victory even mean at this point? If you can't get the oil flowing, have you won? And that single failure, it's kicked off a catastrophic economic chain reaction. And that brings us to the economy. Because this military misstep has caused way more than just a strategic problem. It's triggered what you could literally call a global economic earthquake. The petrodollar system, well, it's on life support. I mean, think about it. For more than half a century, the petrodollar has been the bedrock of America's financial might. The whole world has had to buy and sell oil in US dollars. This basically forces every country to need dollars, which underpins the entire American economy. It's been the ultimate source of power. And just like that, everything's changing. Before, it was simple. Global oil was priced in US dollars, period. Now, Iran controls the strait, and they're calling the shots. They're demanding that transit fees for oil tankers be paid in Chinese yuan. This isn't a small change. They are literally dismantling the petrodollar system, one ship at a time. So what does that mean for you? Well, it means this: $4.06 a gallon. That's the national average for gas right now. This isn't some abstract economic theory. It's what happens. It's what you feel at the pump when the very foundation of the global energy market starts to crumble. And trust me, the pain does not stop at the gas station. It's a brutal ripple effect. Higher oil prices mean it costs more to make fertilizer and ship goods. Those costs get passed on, so food prices go through the roof and supply chains just break. The end result? Economists are throwing around a scary word, stagflation. That's a recession and high inflation at the same time. And they're worried it could spiral into a full-blown global depression. So, as the old US-led system starts to crack under the pressure, a new group is stepping right into that vacuum. We're talking about the BRICS nations. And what we're seeing is the birth of a multipolar world, and it's happening way, way faster than anyone thought possible. And when you hear someone like Russia's Foreign Minister Lavrov say the fight for power across the world is fierce, don't just brush it off as talk. Analysts say this is a mission statement. For Russia and China, this isn't a crisis. It's the opportunity they've been waiting for. It's their chance to speed up their plan for a world that isn't run by just one superpower anymore. And believe me, they are not just talking a big game, they're making moves. While the West is totally bogged down in this war, Putin is working the phones with Gulf leaders. China is rolling out its own peace plans. They're busy building a whole new security system for Eurasia and telling the global South, hey, there's another way. You don't have to follow US leadership. And this new order, it isn't just about politics or military alliances. It's about money. For decades, everything ran through the Western SWIFT system. But now Iran is using China's alternative, called CIPS. And this is a huge deal. It lets countries trade with each other using the Chinese yuan, completely bypassing the US dollar. What we're watching is a parallel financial system being tested and proven in real time. It's a direct challenge to decades of Western economic power. Okay, let's switch gears to something that most people have completely missed in all this chaos. There's a hidden vulnerability here, and military strategists say it gives Iran an incredible, almost unbelievable amount of leverage over its neighbors. So, in a place like the Middle East, what do you think the ultimate weapon is? It's not missiles, it's not even oil. No, the answer is something way more basic: fresh water. And this chart, this reveals everything. It is a massive vulnerability. Look at Iran. Only 3% of its water comes from desalination. But for Saudi Arabia and the Gulf states, it's between 60 and 90%. They rely on these huge vulnerable plants to turn seawater into drinking water. The bottom line is, Iran can take a hit to its water supply and survive. Its U.S. allied neighbors cannot. It is, for all intents and purposes, a strategic checkmate. Which brings us right to the man in the middle of it all, President Trump. And from what multiple reports are saying, he's trapped in what analysts are calling an absolutely impossible no-win situation. And get this, analysts say he's desperate for an exit ramp. So desperate, he's reportedly asking Russia and China for help to find a way out. I mean, just think about that reversal of roles. The President of the United States turning to his biggest rivals to clean up a mess. The very people building the new world order are being asked to save the old one. It's incredible. So as the experts laid out, the U.S. is facing two paths, and both of them lead to disaster. Option 1, withdraw, admit defeat. Analysts are calling this America's Suez moment, just like when the British Empire collapsed after 1956, a total humiliation. Option 2, escalate. That means a massive ground war, which risks a global depression and could even potentially go nuclear. It is the definition of a lose-lose situation. And that's really the core of it. No matter what happens next, whether they pull out or double down, something fundamental has already broken. That quote says it all. The aura of invincibility of the empire, it's over. Also, forever. That perception, that idea that America was untouchable, it's gone. You know, in just over a month, this war has shattered the old chessboard. It's fast-forwarded decades of change into a few short weeks. The game has completely changed, and the world we had 35 days ago, it's just not there anymore. What we have now is a new, much more uncertain, and much more competitive global landscape. So we're left with the biggest question of all. If the American century is truly over, what comes next? It seems pretty clear the era of one single superpower is over, and it ended abruptly. The question isn't if a new order is coming anymore. The real question is, what is it going to look like, and who is going to be in charge?
It is the morning of Friday, April 3, 2026.
Right.
Just ground yourself in that date for a second. We are exactly 35 days into the war, following the U.S. and Israeli attacks on Iran. 35 days.
Which, I mean, it feels like a lifetime already.
It really does. And, you're looking at the cascading numbers on your trading terminal right now, or feeling the shockwaves at the gas pump.
Oh, yeah. The pain at the pump is real.
Right. Or even just tracking the massive redeployment of global supply chains, the absolute velocity of the geopolitical shift that's happening right now.
Yeah, the sheer physics of the global economy have they've been completely altered since the end of February.
Entirely.
The strategic assumptions that basically underwrote Western foreign policy for, the last half century, they are quite literally disintegrating under the pressure of a conflict that was supposed to be this quick surgical intervention.
Which brings us to the exact mission of today's deep dive. We've spent the last 48 hours processing just this absolute mountain of fresh source material.
So much data to sift through.
Seriously. We're talking on-the-ground journalistic reports, deep dive YouTube analyses from leading defense economists, and raw intelligence assessments that are currently circulating among top geopolitical analysts.
Right, the stuff that hasn't even been fully digested by the mainstream yet.
Exactly. And the goal today is to cut through the noise of those, daily press briefings. We are looking beyond the kinetic battlefield to map out how this conflict has, according to the consensus of these analysts in any way, how it has violently backfired on the West.
Because the overarching narrative from these sources, it isn't just about a military stalemate.
Right. We're tracking the acceleration of a new BRICS-led economic architecture, the terrifying realities of resource vulnerabilities in the Gulf, and the terminal crisis of the petrodollar.
It's really about a fundamental miscalculation of leverage. I mean, the West initiated a kinetic conflict to solve a geopolitical problem, completely underestimating the asymmetric and, honestly, the economic and infrastructural counteroffensives that Iran was prepared to launch.
With the quiet backing of Russia and China, of course.
Oh, absolutely. They're the silent partners in all this.
But before we get into the mechanics of that counteroffensive, I need to frame our approach for you, the listener.
Yeah, this is important.
Because the source material we are unpacking today is intensely polarizing. I mean, we are dealing with raw analysis regarding internal power struggles within the U.S. administration, heavily disputed intelligence claims, and allegations about the direct influence of Israeli and U.S. political leadership on the initiation of this war.
Highly charged stuff.
Exactly. So our role here is not to validate these political claims, to take sides, or, to endorse any specific political figure.
Right, we're not cheerleaders here.
We are strictly operating as impartial analysts of the data provided. We are laying out the strategic chessboard exactly as the global intelligence and economic observers describe it, so you can see the pieces moving.
And, understanding those moves requires completely abandoning the standard Western framework of warfare. The strategic reality right now demands a totally different lens.
Let's use an analogy from the sources that I think really crystallizes this.
Oh, the board game one. I love this one.
Yeah. Imagine you're sitting at a table playing a highly complex, high-stakes board game. You realize your position is collapsing, so this desperate kinetic move, you just flip the table.
Just completely upend it.
Right. You scatter the physical pieces everywhere, assuming you've achieved this hard reset. But as the plastic pieces are bouncing off the floor, you look up and realize your opponent barely blinked.
Because they weren't playing the physical board game at all.
Exactly. They were playing on a completely separate digital board underneath the table. By flipping the physical table, all you actually did was permanently sever your own server connection.
That is honestly the perfect architecture of the last 35 days.
It really is. So let's look at how that table flip translates to the current airspace over the Middle East. Because tactically,
it's a different story. If we strictly evaluate the aviation metrics, like the sheer aerospace engineering and logistical output, the U.S. and its coalition have executed flawlessly.
All right, they're flying, over 500 bombing missions a day?
Yeah, a sustained operational tempo of over 500 sorties a day. From a pure strike capability standpoint, dismantling traditional radar installations, achieving air dominance, it is an extraordinary display of force projection.
I mean, the logistics alone of keeping that many airframes fueled, armed, and deconflicted in a contested airspace is staggering.
Oh, it's a logistical miracle.
And on the defensive side, the coalition is intercepting roughly 90% of incoming loitering munitions and ballistic threats.
Right.
In a vacuum, those are dominating metrics. But the analysts in our sources are heavily caveating that success.
Because despite flying 500 uncontested sorties a day, the U.S. Navy has utterly failed its primary strategic mandate.
Keeping the Strait of Hormuz open.
Exactly. And that disconnect between achieving air superiority and failing to secure maritime transit is the defining military paradox of this war.
Which is crazy because the Navy has been planning for this exact scenario for decades, right?
Since the tanker war of the 1980s, the U.S. Navy, specifically the Fifth Fleet, alongside the Marine Corps, has been actively wargaming the closure of Hormuz for 40 years. The doctrine is deeply established.
Yet, when the theoretical became reality, the kinetic application of air power it failed to neutralize the asymmetric maritime threat.
It creates a massive cognitive dissonance when you watch the political rhetoric right now.
Oh, absolutely.
Yeah.
You have President Trump on the airwaves declaring absolute victory.
Right. He's pointing to the initial decapitation strikes that eliminated original Iranian leadership as proof of a functional regime change.
And he's backing that up with ultimatums, threatening to bomb the country, quote, into the Stone Age within 2 to 3 weeks if the remaining decentralized command doesn't capitulate.
But here's the thing. The threat of bombing a nation into the Stone Age relies on an assumption of infinite munitions and zero strategic blowback.
Which is just not the reality.
Not at all. The material reality is dictating a much tighter timeline. Our sources highlight a critical data point. The U.S. military has expended approximately 850 Tomahawk cruise missiles in just 4 weeks.
Wait, hold on. Let's break down the industrial mechanics of that depletion for a second. Because 850 Tomahawks isn't just a big number, it fundamentally alters the U.S. global posture.
Totally. Prior to the end of February, the entire U.S. global inventory of Tomahawks sat at roughly 3,100 units.
Wow.
Yeah. Expend 850 and you have instantly vaporized over a quarter of your premier long-range standoff strike capability.
In just 35 days.
And 35 days. And the defense industrial base cannot simply spin up a third shift to replace them. We are talking about severe bottlenecks here.
Like what kind of bottlenecks?
Solid rocket motor production, highly specialized turbofan engines, and the sourcing of aerospace-grade titanium.
Which you can't just buy off the shelf at Home Depot.
Exactly. Current production lines yield anywhere from 90 to 300 of these missiles annually. So the U.S. just burned through roughly 3 years of maximum capacity manufacturing.
That is terrifying if you zoom out. I mean, if you are a combatant commander in Indompakam, staring across the Taiwan Strait at the People's Liberation Army,
You're sweating right now.
you are watching your primary deterrent evaporate in the Middle East without forcing a strategic capitulation from Tehran.
And it's not just Tomahawks. The sources note that Washington is currently redirecting Patriot missile interceptor shipments that were originally promised to Switzerland and other European allies.
They're pushing them to the back of the queue.
Yes, to desperately backfill the Gulf bases. The attrition math is just ruthless.
And it forces the obvious question, right? Why hasn't absolute air dominance forced an Iranian surrender?
The answer lies in 20 years of subterranean engineering.
The mountain bunkers.
Exactly. Iran observed the U.S. air campaigns in Iraq and Afghanistan. They knew they could never contest the U.S. Air Force symmetrically, so they spent 2 decades burying their ballistic and anti-ship missile infrastructure inside the Zagros Mountains.
So the geological shielding is doing the work that an Air Force would normally do.
You got it. The reports detail facilities buried up to 90 meters deep in solid granite.
90 meters. I mean, what does the U.S. even have that can penetrate that?
Honestly, very little. 90 meters of granite renders even the GBU-57 massive ordnance penetrator, which is the U.S. military's premier bunker buster, highly ineffective.
Wow.
Furthermore, these aren't just static caves. They are complex, decentralized networks with sophisticated blast valve ventilation systems designed to mitigate the immense overpressure from near-miss explosions.
So they basically just pop out, shoot, and hide.
That's exactly the doctrine. They wheel a mobile anti-ship battery out of a concealed adit, fire a volley into the shipping lanes, and retreat back under the mountain before a loitering F-35 can establish a firing solution.
The asymmetry there is just bleeding the coalition dry. You don't need a multi-billion-dollar blue water navy to project power over a narrow 21-mile choke point.
No, you just need persistent, survivable, cheap threats, which leads directly into the drone attack on the Prince Sultan Air Base in Saudi Arabia.
Yes, let's talk about that, because that strike perfectly encapsulates the failure of conventional air defense economics.
Prince Sultan is nominally protected by a multi-layered, integrated air defense system, right? Patriot batteries for high-altitude ballistic threats, augmented by shorter-range point defenses.
Top-of-the-line stuff.
Yet, an incoming swarm penetrated the perimeter.
And the cost-exchange ratio detailed in these defense analyses is almost mathematically fatal. I mean, Patriot PAC-3 interceptor or an AIM-120 AMRAAM fired from a combat air patrol costs anywhere from $500,000 to well over $1 million per shot.
Per shot.
Meanwhile, the loitering munitions they're intercepting, which largely utilize commercial off-the-shelf components, carbon fiber bodies, and basically moped engines, cost perhaps $40,000.
When you fire $1 million interceptor at a $40,000 drone, even a successful hit is a strategic defeat.
Because you're financially exhausting your defensive magazine.
Exactly. The U.S. failed to adequately scale cheaper, specialized counter-UAS platforms like the Coyote or the Roadrunner early enough.
Completely ignoring the glaring lessons from the airspace over Ukraine.
Right. Furthermore, radar systems designed to filter out birds and ground clutter often struggle to acquire the low radar cross-section and minimal thermal signature of these slow-moving drones.
So they literally slip under the radar.
Yeah. And think about the math. If a swarm of 50 drones attacks and the Patriot system successfully intercepts 45, that's a 90% success rate, which sounds great.
But those 5 that slip through.
Those 5 can still disable a multi-million-dollar AOACS on the tarmac or destroy a critical radar array. The defense is required to be flawless. The offense only requires statistical luck.
That economic attrition is crippling. But, the tactical situation on the ground actually masks a much more terrifying strategic vulnerability.
Oh, the water situation. This is where it gets really dark.
When we look at the Gulf Cooperation Council, the GCC nations like Saudi Arabia and the UAE, we naturally assume their primary geopolitical anxiety revolves around the flow of crude oil.
Right, because that's their whole economy.
Exactly. But the intelligence memos circulating right now point to an entirely different existential threat. It's not energy, it's water.
The structural vulnerability of the Gulf states is arguably the most underreported dynamic of this entire conflict.
I couldn't agree more.
These nations are essentially hyper-modern miracles of engineering, layered over one of the most inhospitable, hyper-arid environments on the planet. Cities like Riyadh, Abu Dhabi, Dubai, they cannot be sustained by natural aquifers.
No, they're entirely reliant on massive industrial-scale desalination infrastructure.
The sources cite a chilling metric regarding Riyadh. The Saudi capital, which is a city of over 7 million people, relies almost entirely on desalinated water pumped hundreds of kilometers inland from the Al Jubail complex on the coast of the Persian Gulf.
And Al Jubail, along with similar facilities across the UAE, they utilize complex cogeneration power and desalination technologies, right? Like multi-stage flash distillation and reverse osmosis.
Yeah. And these are sprawling, highly exposed industrial targets. They rely on massive seawater intake pipes directly exposed to the Gulf.
And Iran has explicitly signaled that the water infrastructure of any Gulf state hosting U.S. military assets or allowing its airspace to be utilized for strike packages is considered a legitimate military target.
Which is an impossible threat profile to defend against perfectly.
Because all it takes is one swarm.
Exactly. A single, low-flying drone swarm that impacts the primary reverse osmosis membrane arrays or damages the cogeneration power plants driving the high-pressure pumps that instantly triggers a countdown to a catastrophic humanitarian event.
There are no vast reservoirs of fresh water to fall back on.
None. To visualize this, think of the entire Gulf economy as an unimaginably expensive state-of-the-art server farm. It has biometric security, liquid cooling, the fastest processors on Earth, but the architects forgot to enclose the single main power conduit that runs along the outside wall of the building.
And Iran is standing next to that conduit with a pair of bolt cutters.
Precisely. And the timeline is the most brutal factor here. An economic recession or an energy crisis unfolds over months and quarters. A water crisis in a desert metropolis unfolds in hours.
Because of the ambient heat.
Right. In the ambient heat of the Arabian Peninsula, widespread dehydration begins within days. And the logistical reality is that you simply cannot airlift enough palletized water to sustain populations of that scale.
7 million people in Riyadh alone. You can't fly that much to Sania.
You really can't. An attack on the desalination nodes would trigger a mass chaotic exodus, millions of people attempting to flee an environment that is actively killing them.
It wouldn't just be an emergency, it would effectively dissolve the state itself. The urban centers would revert to uninhabitable sand.
And the realization of this physical reality has triggered absolute panic within the diplomatic channels of Abu Dhabi and Riyadh.
I mean, wouldn't you panic? The intelligence assessments indicate they are violently pulling back from the U.S.-led operational framework.
Because they bought into the American security umbrella under the assumption that U.S. Patriot batteries and THAAD systems provided this impenetrable dome.
But the last 35 days have shattered that doctrine.
Totally shattered it. They are watching U.S. air defenses fail to achieve a 100% intercept rate against cheap drones. They look at their exposed coastal water intakes and realize the United States Air Force cannot guarantee their physical survival.
Consequently, the alliance is fracturing under the weight of sheer self-preservation.
Yeah. So while the Gulf leadership is staring at their desalination intakes in terror, the rest of the world, the global markets, are screaming into the void about the resource that is now effectively locked inside that same body of water.
Right. Which brings us to the closure of Hormuz, the economic shockwave, and basically the terminal event for the petrodollar.
This is where the global economy just tilts on its axis.
Yeah. And the physical closure of the strait is fascinating because it didn't require a continuous kinetic blockade by the Iranian Navy.
No, not at all. The waters were actually sealed by the invisible hand of the global insurance markets weeks ago.
The critical date in the economic reporting is March 4th. That was the day the syndicates at Lloyd's of London formally pulled their maritime insurance coverage for any commercial hull entering the region.
And if you know anything about the mechanics of maritime shipping, you know that no multinational shipping conglomerate will move a $100 million crude carrier without comprehensive protection and indemnity, and specifically, war risk insurance.
It's just not going to happen.
Once the actuaries in London calculated the probability of a drone strike or a magnetic limpet mine, the war risk premium spiked to 10, maybe 15% of the hull's value.
Rendering the voyages economically suicidal.
Exactly. The moment the underwriters stepped back, the physical ships dropped anchor. The strait was closed by spreadsheet.
Closed by spreadsheet. And the mathematical result of that spreadsheet is the immediate removal of 15 million barrels of oil a day from the global supply chain.
15 million barrels, that's catastrophic.
And the physical reality hit the consumer instantly. U.S. domestic gas prices surged 36% in 4 weeks, flowing past $4.66 a gallon.
And aviation fuel markets are effectively broken.
Completely. Jet fuel out of the Singapore hub tripled to over $231 a barrel, triggering immediate massive layoffs across global commercial airlines.
But you know, the true architectural shift isn't just the price spike. We've seen supply shocks before. What changes the global order is how Iran is choosing to leverage the choke point.
Right, because they haven't just mined the waters indiscriminately.
No, they have established a heavily armed, highly selective toll booth.
The maritime reports confirm Iran is permitting safe transit for specifically flagged vessels, explicitly offering free passage to Chinese and Russian carriers.
And for those not on the geopolitical VIP list, transit is possible, but it requires a physical toll.
And the mechanism of that toll is what detonates the existing financial order, because Iran is demanding payment strictly in Chinese yuan.
This is the precise mechanism of the petrodollar meltdown. To understand the gravity of this, you have to look at the post-1971 global financial plumbing.
The Bretton Woods system.
Yeah. The U.S. dollar's absolute hegemony is underwritten by the structural necessity that global energy is cleared in dollars. If an emerging market economy wants to import crude, they must first acquire U.S. dollars.
Creating a perpetual, artificial global demand for U.S. currency.
Exactly. That demand absorbs American inflation, it finances U.S. deficit spending, and it grants Washington the power to weaponize the SWIFT banking system.
So if you force the clearing of energy transactions outside the dollar,
you collapse the foundational pillar of U.S. economic leverage. By enforcing a yuan toll for the world's most vital commodity, Iran is publicly demonstrating that the global south can bypass the American financial system entirely.
And the macroeconomic reaction has been violent. Foreign central banks, observing that they may no longer need massive dollar reserves to guarantee their energy security, have begun aggressively dumping U.S. Treasury bonds.
It's a full-on panic sell-off.
But let me interrupt here, because the domestic audience always hits a wall on this exact point.
Sure. What's the hang-up?
The U.S. political rhetoric constantly touts energy independence.
Right.
We hear about the Permian Basin, fracking, massive domestic production. If the U.S. is pumping millions of barrels in Texas, why is the average American consumer getting crushed at the pump just because a strait on the other side of the planet is closed?
It's a great question, but it stems from a fundamental misunderstanding of both commodity markets and petroleum chemistry.
Okay, unpack that for us.
First, crude oil is a fungible, globally traded asset. Regardless of where it's pumped, it is sold at the global benchmark price. When a massive supply shock removes 15 million barrels from the global pool, desperate buyers in Europe and Asia bid the price of the remaining barrels into the stratosphere.
So domestic U.S. producers just sell into that global market at the new hyperinflated price.
Exactly. They aren't going to offer a patriotic discount to a gas station in Ohio when a buyer in Frankfurt is offering double.
Right. That's just capitalism.
But the deeper structural issue lies in the American refinery architecture. The U.S. shale boom produces overwhelmingly light, sweet crude.
Okay.
However, massive complexes along the U.S. Gulf Coast were engineered decades ago at the cost of billions of dollars, specifically to crack heavy, sour crude imported from the Middle East and Venezuela.
Why build them like that?
Because heavy crude used to be cheaper. They use massive coker units to break down the heavy sludge into high-margin middle distillates like diesel and jet fuel. You cannot simply pipeline Texas crude into a refinery calibrated for heavy Saudi crude.
The chemistry just doesn't work.
The chemistry and the thermal dynamics do not work. So the U.S. exports its light crude and remains structurally dependent on importing heavy crude. When Hormuz closes, the heavy crude vanishes, and the U.S. refinery output collapses, spiking the price at the domestic pump.
The interconnectivity is just absolute. And the financial markets know it. Which brings us to the deeply unsettling anomalies detailed in the financial reporting.
Oh, the March 23rd anomaly.
Yeah, the geopolitical sources flagged a massive, highly suspicious market movement on March 23rd.
The futures dump.
Exactly. 15 minutes before President Trump published a social media statement specifically designed to project calm, insinuating that back-channel negotiations were yielding positive results. Algorithmic trading desks registered a massive dump of $580 million in oil futures contracts.
Yeah, when you see $500 million in heavily leveraged futures moved minutes before a market-moving political statement, the immediate conclusion is institutional front-running.
It suggests that highly sensitive geopolitical intelligence decisions dictating war, peace, and global energy flows is bleeding into the hands of financial insiders before it reaches the public.
Which is terrifying when you combine that level of perceived systemic corruption with the 10-year Treasury yield violently crossing the 4.4% threshold.
Which economists view as the absolute danger zone for sovereign debt stability.
Right. When you combine those, the economic picture is just catastrophic.
And the domestic economy bleeding out is instantly manifesting as a massive fracture within the U.S. political leadership.
Oh, the facade of a unified bipartisan war cabinet evaporated weeks ago. The internal splintering is severe and it's incredibly public.
The most glaring data point in the intelligence reporting is the resignation of Joe Kent from the National Counterterrorism Center.
He didn't just resign quietly either.
No, he released a blistering public statement categorically denying that Iran posed an imminent nuclear threat, which was the stated casus belli for the conflict. He explicitly pointed to immense pressure from Israeli lobbying networks as the primary driver, pushing the administration into the kinetic strikes.
And that dissent is structurally reinforced by the Director of National Intelligence herself.
Right, Tulsi Gabbard.
The sources reference her testimony before the Senate Intelligence Committee. Under oath, the DNI confirmed the consensus assessment of the intelligence apparatus. Iran's nuclear weaponization program had been neutralized years prior, and there was no actionable intelligence suggesting a resumption of those efforts.
Think about that. You have the head of the intelligence community sitting in front of Congress, actively invalidating the exact justification the White House used to launch 500 bombing missions a day.
The administration has factionalized entirely at this point.
The reporting details how Vice President J.D. Vance, representing a more non-interventionist, isolationist wing of the administration, was effectively walled off from the operational planning.
He was systematically marginalized by the hawkish wing of the cabinet, heavily driven by Secretary of State Marco Rubio, who championed a maximum pressure, kinetic first doctrine.
They basically bet the entire geopolitical standing of the United States on the assumption of a rapid surgical victory.
But the math of that victory never worked. And this introduces the concept the defense analysts refer to as imperial overstretch.
Right.
If air power fails to achieve regime change, the only doctrinal alternative is ground occupation. But the geographic and demographic reality of Iran makes that a mathematical impossibility.
Because American political memory is heavily anchored to the 2003 invasion of Iraq.
Exactly. But attempting to overlay the Iraq operational template onto Iran is strategic suicide. Geographically, Iran is a fortress. It is roughly the combined size of France, Germany, and Italy, defined by towering, impassable mountain ranges and vast deserts.
And the U.S. military currently maintains a total active duty force of under 1.4 million personnel, right?
Globally distributed, mind you.
Yeah.
And struggling with severe multi-year recruitment deficits.
So what would an actual invasion require?
Well, the combat analysts project that an actual ground invasion, followed by the pacification and occupation of a hostile, highly nationalistic population of nearly 90 million people, would require an absolute minimum of 1.5 million combat troops.
Just for Iran?
It's just for Iran. And given the modern military tail-to-tooth ratio, where it takes roughly 10 logistical and support personnel to sustain one trigger puller on the front line, generating a combat force of that size would require instituting a comprehensive national draft.
Wow. Imagine the administration currently overseeing a splintering cabinet, a collapsing economy, and DNI testimony that the war was initiated on faulty intelligence, attempting to pass a selective service call-up.
The domestic political environment would just detonate. It is utterly impossible. The administration lacks the capital, the munitions, and the manpower.
So how did they calculate this risk? I mean, somebody had to sign off on this.
The intelligence sources point directly to external reliance. The analysis suggests Washington effectively outsourced its strategic risk assessment to allied intelligence services.
Specifically, the Israeli Mossad under Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu.
Right. the January briefings. The reports explicitly detail a presentation delivered by Mossad leadership to the White House earlier this year.
What did it say?
The assessment confidently projected that the Iranian domestic structure was entirely brittle. It promised that a concentrated, high-intensity campaign of decapitation strikes against military and political leadership would immediately trigger a massive, organic, civilian uprising.
Resulting in a total collapse of the regime within 12 to 14 days.
Exactly. It is a classic failure of intelligence mirror imaging. You assume the adversary will react exactly the way you want them to.
So the West relied on a 12-day timetable.
And we are now on day 35.
The regime did not collapse, it decentralized and entrenched. The uprising never materialized, and the U.S. military is now anchored to an unwinnable theater, rapidly burning through its strategic reserves.
And while Washington is consumed by this self-inflicted strategic paralysis, the geopolitical center of gravity has aggressively shifted.
Which brings us to the architectural redesign of the global order, the BRICS ascension and the crystallization of a multinodal world.
Yeah, if you want to identify the absolute victors of this conflict, you look to Moscow and Beijing. They are executing a masterclass in grand strategy, achieving massive geopolitical gains without committing a single battalion to the fight.
Let's examine the Russian position first, because the entire framework of Western policy for the last few years has been designed to economically isolate and starve the Russian state over the conflict in Ukraine.
Right.
Instead, this Middle East crisis has handed them an economic lifeline.
Oh, a massive lifeline. With 15 million barrels of Gulf oil sidelined, global crude prices have blown past any artificial Western price caps. Russia is exporting its Ural crude at massive premiums to eager markets in Asia, flooding their treasury with capital.
Simultaneously, the U.S. defense industrial base is so singularly focused on rushing Patriot interceptors and JDAM kits to the Middle East that the logistical pipeline to Eastern Europe has effectively run dry.
Yeah, Ukrainian President Zelensky is acutely aware that the American arsenal is empty, and the momentum on the ground has decisively shifted in Russia's favor.
It's a textbook proxy victory. But China's maneuvering is even more profound, I think.
Definitely. While the U.S. is trapped in a cycle of kinetic escalation, threatening to bomb sovereign nations into the Stone Age, Beijing has seamlessly stepped into the vacuum to play the role of the responsible, stabilizing adult in the room.
China is aggressively moving to establish itself as the indispensable mediator. Diplomatic sources confirm Beijing is quietly floating a comprehensive five-point peace framework.
But crucially, they aren't dictating it directly from Beijing.
Right.
They are utilizing Pakistan as a diplomatic conduit, hosting multilateral talks in Islamabad, bringing together regional heavyweights like Saudi Arabia, Turkey, and Egypt.
They are building an Eastern diplomatic architecture that fundamentally excludes the State Department.
Russian Foreign Minister Sergei Lavrov articulated the doctrine behind this perfectly. He explicitly noted that the global system has moved past the American unipolar moment, but it isn't settling into a standard multipolar dynamic.
He used the term multinodal.
Yes, and the distinction between multipolar and multinodal is vital. A multipolar world implies a few massive, concentrated centers of gravity like the US, the USSR, and perhaps a non-aligned bloc during the Cold War.
So what's multinodal?
A multinodal world operates on the architectural logic of a decentralized digital network. Power, capital, and influence are distributed across a vast array of interconnected nodes. The expanded BRICS nations, the Shanghai Cooperation Organization, ASEAN.
And if Washington attempts to sanction or isolate one specific node, the economic traffic simply routes around the damage.
Exactly. The network is inherently resilient to Western financial weaponry.
And the core processing engine of this new network is the strategic alignment between Russia, China, and Iran.
The Primakov Triangle.
Right. Analysts bring this up a lot. This isn't just a traditional mutual defense treaty. It is the construction of a parallel macroeconomic universe designed to permanently bypass the West.
And that bypass requires new financial plumbing. We mentioned the petrodollar earlier and how the U.S. utilizes the SWIFT banking system to enforce its hegemony.
So how does the Primakov Triangle actually circumvent that?
Well, SWIFT is essentially a messaging layer. It routes the instructions for international capital transfers, which ultimately clear through Western correspondent banks, often in New York. If you are cut off from SWIFT, you cannot send the message to move the money.
But China anticipated this vulnerability, right?
Yes, they spent the last decade building CIPS, the cross-border interbank payment system. CIPS doesn't just send messages, it provides the actual clearing and settlement services for cross-border transactions, and it does so exclusively in renminbi.
Wow.
By shifting the massive energy trade of the Gulf onto the CIPS network, they completely insulate their supply chains from U.S. Treasury sanctions.
Let me challenge the logic here, though. If the chaos in the Middle East is accelerating the collapse of American hegemony, draining U.S. munitions and driving up Russian oil profits, why would China intervene with a peace plan?
That's a fair point.
Doesn't the strategic calculus dictate that Beijing should just let Washington bleed out in the desert indefinitely?
The calculus changes when you factor in China's domestic macroeconomic reality. China is not a chaotic actor. It is a hyper-industrialized export economy. They require total global systemic stability to absorb their manufacturing output.
Ah, I see.
If oil hits $300 a barrel, the resulting global depression crushes consumer demand in Europe and the Americas, which directly throttles Chinese factory output and risks massive domestic unemployment.
Which is the ultimate fear of the CCP.
Exactly. China wants to dismantle American unipolarity, but they need the global marketplace to remain functional while they do it. By brokering the peace, they guarantee their own energy security, stabilize their export markets, and permanently cement their status as the new global guarantor.
And capital invariably flees chaos and seeks stability. The economic reporting provided a glaring example of this capital flight.
BASF.
Yeah, BASF.
Yeah.
A German chemical titan and a foundational pillar of European heavy industry is actively migrating.
Starved of cheap Russian natural gas due to the Ukraine war, and now facing crippling energy costs due to the Hormuz closure, BASF is constructing a massive $10 billion Verbund site in southern China.
They are relocating the industrial heart of Europe to Asia, specifically to access the cheap, reliable Russian energy that China has secured through the Premikov Triangle.
We are witnessing the real-time deindustrialization of the European continent. Western capital is bypassing Western sanctions and Western wars, flowing relentlessly east.
Which forces us to look at the incredibly bleak reality facing Washington right now. We're looking at the only viable off-ramp left for the administration.
And it is an off-ramp built entirely of concessions.
Because the political clock is deafening. The U.S. midterms are rapidly approaching. President Trump is staring down a catastrophic domestic economic contraction, a paralyzed military theater, and a voter base that is feeling the acute pain of $4 gas and a contracting labor market.
He desperately needs an exit strategy.
But the diplomatic sources confirm he has indefinitely postponed a heavily telegraphed May trip to meet with Xi Jinping in Beijing.
You cannot negotiate from a position of systemic weakness. If Trump travels to Beijing now, he holds zero leverage. He cannot threaten sweeping tariffs when the global supply chain is already fracturing and U.S. inflation is soaring.
And he cannot project military deterrence in the Pacific when a third of his Tomahawk inventory is sitting in smoking craters in the Zagros Mountains.
Right. Furthermore, the State Department cannot simply open direct back channels with Tehran.
The diplomatic trust deficit is absolute. The Iranians view the American political structure as inherently volatile.
From their perspective, the U.S. unilaterally abrogated the JCPOA nuclear framework, assassinated Qasem Soleimani, and launched a massive unprovoked kinetic war on their territory.
Lavrov explicitly weaponized this reality in his recent addresses, labeling the United States as, quote, non-agreement capable.
The implication is devastating. Why sign a treaty with the current administration when the subsequent administration will simply tear it up to score domestic political points?
So the U.S. military cannot secure the strait. The U.S. State Department cannot negotiate a ceasefire. The leverage is gone.
Which leaves Washington with a deeply bitter pill to swallow. The only entities remaining on the geopolitical board with the leverage, the trust, and the capital to enforce the cessation of hostilities are Russia and China.
The United States, the sole remaining superpower of the 20th century, has to quietly stand aside and allow its two primary geopolitical rivals to dictate the terms of peace in the Middle East.
By relying on Beijing to broker the off-ramp, Washington is officially transferring the mantle of regional security guarantor to the East.
And the resulting damage to the Western alliance network is likely terminal. The think tank analyses, particularly out of Chatham House in London, are incredibly grim.
Yeah, they note that the European capitals, having refused to commit their own depleted forces to the Gulf conflict, are now facing the wrath of an isolated and furious U.S. administration.
The reporting suggests Trump is actively threatening to dismantle the NATO architecture and sever the special relationship with the UK in retaliation.
We are looking at the potential balkanization of the West. A fractured, politically paralyzed United States and a deindustrialized, energy-starved Europe suddenly forced to navigate a global economy entirely dominated by a highly integrated, resource-rich global South.
Let's pull all of this together. Over the last hour, we've unpacked the anatomy of a 35-day war. A conflict initiated under the assumption of a 12-day surgical decapitation that would reassert Western dominance.
Instead, while the U.S. Air Force achieved tactical dominance in the skies, the strategic objectives just completely evaporated.
The conflict exposed the profound vulnerabilities of the U.S. defense industrial base against asymmetric drone warfare. It highlighted the terrifying terminal fragility of the Gulf states' water infrastructure.
It triggered the economic ceiling of the world's most vital energy choke point, detonating the petrodollar system as Iran forced the clearing of energy tolls in Chinese yuan.
And ultimately, it handed the diplomatic and economic keys of the 21st century directly to the BRICS network.
The tactical execution of the war was flawless. The strategic architecture beneath it completely collapsed.
And for you listening to this isn't just an abstract exercise in geopolitical theory. When you see the massive volatility in your retirement accounts, when you look at the supply chain shortages hitting the logistics networks, or when you watch the fracturing of alliances that have stood since the end of the Second World War, you are watching the violent, real-time birth of a new macroeconomic epoch.
Absolutely.
You're living through the exact definable moment when the fulcrum of global power formally shifted away from the West.
The parameters of the global system have been permanently rewritten. But, there is one final overarching question embedded in all of these intelligence reports, a concept the financial analysts are almost too terrified to fully model out.
What's that?
Well, for the better part of a century, the United States has been the undisputed guarantor of the global commons. The U.S. Navy kept the sea lanes open, and the U.S. dollar provided frictionless, stable liquidity.
Right, safety.
Because of that perceived absolute stability, trillions upon trillions of dollars in global capital have inherently flowed into American equities, American debt, and American institutions. But when that core illusion shatters, when the Fifth Fleet cannot clear a 21-mile strait, and the dollar loses its exclusive monopoly on global energy, what happens to that underlying gravity?
That's the terrifying part.
When the foundational security of the American system is disproven in real time, where do those trillions of dollars run to next?
That is the ultimate question hanging over the markets right now. Thank you for joining us on this deep dive into the source material. Keep analyzing the data, keep questioning the official narratives, and we will catch you next time.